I am Henry, 72 years old, and I spent my entire career designing suspension bridges meant to withstand the most violent earthquakes. Yet I never saw the catastrophic structural failure occurring inside my own home until a routine Tuesday afternoon. I had taken my wife Martha to the dentist for a simple molar extraction. The clinic was quiet. I sat in the waiting room reading a magazine while the rain beat against the windows. Then Dr. Foster walked out of the examination room. She did not wear the polite, reassuring smile of a medical professional. Her face was the color of chalk. She grabbed my arm with unexpected strength, pulled me into her private office, and locked the heavy oak door behind us. She turned her computer monitor toward me and pointed a trembling pen at a panoramic X-ray of my wife's head. Dr. Foster stated that Martha had 6 distinct healed fractures radiating across her cranial vault. She looked me directly in the eye and said she was calling clinic security because these injuries were not the result of clumsiness. They were the undeniable markers of severe, repeated blunt force trauma. Before I tell you how this single horrific revelation forced me to systematically dismantle the lives of the people I loved most, please let me know which city you are listening from in the comments below. If you have ever had to face a terrifying truth about your own blood, hit the like button and subscribe to support this channel. The silence in that small, sterile office was absolute. The only sound was the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the rushing blood in my own ears. I stared at the high-resolution black and white image on the screen. As a civil engineer, I have spent decades analyzing stress fractures in concrete and steel. I know what structural trauma looks like. The glowing white lines spiderwebbing across the dark curve of Martha's parietal bone were not natural anomalies. They were impact zones. Dr. Foster stood between me and the locked door. Her hand hovered over the telephone on her desk. She demanded to know exactly what was happening in my house. She demanded to know who was hitting my wife. I felt a sudden violent surge of nausea. I raised my hands in a gesture of surrender, my voice shaking as I tried to articulate a defense. I told Dr. Foster that she was making a catastrophic mistake. I explained that Martha had simply been suffering from severe dizzy spells over the past 2 years. I detailed how my son Colin and his wife Rachel had graciously moved into our large family home specifically to act as her primary caregivers. I told the doctor about the wooden staircase in the back of the house. I recounted how Martha had tripped and fallen down those stairs at least 6 times in the last 24 months. I desperately tried to paint a picture of a loving, dedicated family struggling with the natural decline of an elderly woman. I needed Dr. Foster to believe me because the alternative was too monstrous to comprehend. Dr. Foster did not soften. Her expression hardened into clinical fury. She systematically dismantled my excuses with ruthless medical logic. She explained the basic laws of biomechanics. She told me that when an elderly person falls down a flight of stairs, the human body instinctively attempts to protect the head. A falling woman breaks her wrists. She fractures her collarbone. She shatters her hip. Dr. Foster tapped the screen sharply with her fingernail. She stated that a person does not sustain 6 localized radial impact fractures to the top and back of the skull from tumbling down carpeted wooden steps. These specific injuries are caused by a solid object striking the bone with deliberate, repeated velocity. She picked up the telephone receiver and announced that she was legally obligated to contact Adult Protective Services to have Martha immediately removed from my custody. My internal paradigm shattered completely. The defensive walls I had built around my son collapsed. I thought about the days Martha had spent confined to her bed, groggy and bruised, while Rachel assured me she was just resting after another clumsy accident. I thought about how Colin had recently taken over my finances, claiming it would relieve my stress. The terrifying truth rushed in to fill the void left by my denial. My son and my daughter-in-law were actively hurting my wife. I stepped forward and placed my hand firmly over the telephone receiver, pressing it down to disconnect the line. I looked Dr. Foster in the eyes and made a desperate plea. I offered her full access to my own medical records. I offered to submit to an immediate psychological evaluation to prove I was not the abuser. I begged her for exactly 24 hours to return to my house, gather undeniable proof of what Colin and Rachel were doing, and extract my wife safely without alerting them to our knowledge. Dr. Foster stared at me for a long time, evaluating the sincerity in my panicked eyes. Slowly, she released the phone. She agreed to give me 1 day, but she confiscated my medical proxy on the spot, typing a frantic note into Martha's digital file. Just as she reached out to unlock the office door, a massive physical blow struck the wood from the outside. The door handle rattled violently. Colin burst into the clinic hallway. He completely ignored the startled receptionist at the front desk. He marched directly toward us, his chest heaving, his face flushed with aggressive panic. He did not ask how his mother's dental procedure went. He did not ask why I was locked in an office with the doctor. He pointed a rigid finger at Dr. Foster and demanded that she release his mother to him this exact second. He threatened to drag the clinic into a massive malpractice lawsuit for holding an elderly patient against her will. He shouted that we were incompetent and that he was taking Martha home where she belonged. I stood frozen, observing my own son through a new horrifying lens. Colin never once made eye contact with Dr. Foster. His eyes darted nervously around the room, eventually landing on the glowing computer monitor displaying the X-ray. I watched the muscles in his jaw clench. I watched a bead of sweat trace down his temple. His posture was not the stance of a concerned child. It was the volatile, cornered posture of a guilty man, desperate to reclaim his hostage. He shoved past me, grabbed a groggy Martha by her arm with entirely too much force, and began pulling her toward the exit. In that precise moment, any lingering doubt evaporated from my mind. The architect of my wife's suffering was standing right in front of me. I did not yell. I did not confront him in the lobby. I simply followed him out to the parking lot, walking in absolute silence, already calculating the blueprint for his total destruction. The rain slammed against the windshield of the sedan as we drove away from the dental clinic. I sat in the passenger seat while Colin drove. He gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, his jaw clenched tight enough to grind his teeth into dust. My wife Martha sat in the back seat. Her head lolled against the leather headrest, still heavily sedated from the incomplete extraction. The silence inside the vehicle was absolute and suffocating. I did not ask Colin where we were going. I did not demand an explanation for his violent outburst in Dr. Foster's office. I simply watched the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers and studied the man I had raised. Every time the brake lights of the car ahead illuminated his face, I saw the undeniable markers of a cornered predator. He checked the rearview mirror obsessively. He accelerated aggressively through yellow traffic lights, desperate to return to the territory he controlled. For 2 years, I had convinced myself that Colin's abrupt decision to move into our home was a sacrifice born of filial devotion. I had praised his dedication to his mother. Now trapped in the enclosed space of the moving car, I recognized the terrifying reality. He had not moved in to protect us. He had moved in to establish a siege. The heavy sedan turned onto our affluent, tree-lined street. The manicured lawns and towering oak trees had always represented safety to me. Today, they looked like the fortified walls of a prison camp. Colin pressed the button on his sun visor, and our heavy iron driveway gates swung open. He did not park in the driveway. He pulled the car directly into the garage and hit the button to bring the heavy wooden door down behind us, sealing us in the dark. The interior door leading to the kitchen opened before Colin even turned off the engine. Rachel stood on the threshold. My daughter-in-law did not wear the warm, accommodating smile she usually reserved for the country club or our wealthy neighbors. Her face was set in a rigid, furious mask. She wore a tailored silk blouse purchased with my credit card, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She stepped down into the dimly lit garage and marched straight toward the rear passenger door. She did not ask about Martha's dental procedure. She did not ask how I was feeling. She opened the door and hauled Martha out of the back seat with a brutal, terrifying efficiency. Martha groaned, her eyes half open, her feet dragging against the concrete floor. I unbuckled my seatbelt and stepped out of the car, instinctively reaching out to help my wife. Rachel slapped my hand away with stinging force. Her diamond engagement ring cut sharply against my knuckles. She hissed at me to stay exactly where I was. She draped Martha's heavy, limp arm over her own shoulder and began dragging her up the wooden steps into the house. I watched my wife's orthopedic shoes scrape against the floorboards. Colin stood by the hood of the car, completely silent, acting as a physical barricade between me and my wife. He watched his wife haul his mother into the kitchen like a heavy sack of grain, and he did absolutely nothing. I realized then that Colin was not the architect of this nightmare. He was merely the enforcer. Rachel was the commanding officer. I followed them slowly into the kitchen. The house felt entirely different. The familiar scent of lemon polish and fresh coffee was gone, replaced by a cold, clinical hostility. I heard heavy footsteps moving up the main staircase. I walked into the hallway just in time to see Rachel shove Martha into the master bedroom. The heavy oak door slammed shut. I heard the distinct metallic click of the deadbolt sliding into place. They had installed a lock on the outside of my own bedroom door without my knowledge. I took a step toward the stairs, but Rachel was already descending. She moved with the predatory grace of someone who had just consolidated absolute power. She stopped 2 steps above me, forcing me to look up at her. She held out her open palm. She commanded me to hand over my car keys. I stood perfectly still, letting the gravity of her demand settle in the quiet house. I asked her why she needed my keys. Rachel smiled, but the expression never reached her cold, calculating eyes. She informed me that my driving privileges were permanently revoked. She stated that my erratic behavior at the dental clinic proved my cognitive decline was accelerating. She fabricated a lie right to my face, claiming the clinic receptionist had called her to report that I was confused and combative. Rachel told me that I was a danger to myself and a massive liability to the family. She wiggled her fingers, demanding the keys again. I could have fought her. I could have shouted and demanded the police. But I remembered Dr. Foster's warning. I needed 24 hours to gather undeniable proof, and I could not afford to provoke an immediate violent retaliation. I reached into my coat pocket. I pulled out the heavy keyring holding the keys to the sedan, the house, and my old engineering office. I dropped them into her waiting palm. The metal jingled loudly in the silent foyer. Rachel closed her fist around the keys, dropping them into her designer pocket. She stepped down to my level and leaned in close to my face. She told me that from this moment forward, I was not permitted to leave the house without her express permission. She declared that she would manage all medical appointments, all grocery deliveries, and all communication with the outside world. She turned her back on me and walked into the kitchen, leaving me standing alone in the shadows of the hallway. The domestic prison was fully established. I had surrendered my mobility, but in the silence of that house, my mind began constructing the precise mechanism of their total ruin. The digital clock on the wooden nightstand shifted to 2 in the morning. I lay perfectly still on the narrow mattress of the downstairs guest room. I had not slept a single second. The house was entirely silent, but the quiet offered no peace. It was the heavy, expectant silence of a structure under immense pressure just before a catastrophic failure. I threw off the thin cotton blanket and swung my legs over the edge of the bed. My joints ached with the cold and the accumulated stress of the day. I ignored the pain. I needed to move. I needed evidence. Rachel had locked Martha in the master bedroom, but I knew where they kept the daily medications. They had moved everything to the locked cabinet in the downstairs utility corridor 2 weeks ago, claiming it was for safety. I opened my bedroom door with agonizing slowness, applying upward pressure on the brass handle to prevent the internal mechanism from clicking. I stepped out into the dark hallway. As a civil engineer, I know every load-bearing wall, every floor joist, and every stress point in this house. I built the addition myself 20 years ago. I knew exactly which oak floorboards would groan under the weight of a 72-year-old man and which ones were supported directly by the foundational beams below. I moved through the darkness like a ghost in my own home. I placed my feet meticulously, rolling my weight from the outer edge of my heel to the ball of my foot. I passed the base of the main staircase. I could hear the faint, rhythmic drone of a television coming from the second floor. Colin was awake up there. One wrong step, one creaking board, and he would descend the stairs. I held my breath and slipped into the utility corridor, located just off the kitchen. The air in the corridor was cold. A sliver of moonlight filtered through the high ventilation window, illuminating the white metal medicine cabinet mounted on the wall. I reached out and touched the cold steel door. Rachel had secured the latch with a heavy brass padlock. It was a standard commercial lock, the kind you buy at any local hardware store. Most people see a padlock and assume their secrets are safe. An engineer sees a simple arrangement of spring-loaded pins and tension cylinders waiting to be manipulated. I did not have my tools. Rachel had confiscated my keys and locked my workshop in the garage. But I did not need professional equipment to defeat a cheap metal cylinder. I needed a shim. I moved silently into the kitchen and opened the recycling bin under the sink. I searched the glass and plastic until my fingers brushed against a discarded aluminum soda can. I pulled it out. I retrieved a pair of heavy kitchen shears from the wooden knife block on the counter. Working entirely by touch in the dark, I pierced the thin aluminum shell. I cut a small rectangular strip of metal about 2 inches long and half an inch wide. I folded the edges of the metal strip with my thumbs, creating a rigid curved tool perfectly shaped to slide into the narrow gap of the padlock shackle. My hands trembled slightly. It was not from fear. It was from the suppressed rage boiling in my chest. I took a deep, steadying breath to calm my heart rate. I walked back into the utility corridor and approached the locked cabinet. I gripped the body of the brass padlock with my left hand, applying a steady downward pressure to bind the internal locking mechanism. With my right hand, I slid the curved aluminum shim down the inside track of the U-shaped shackle. The gap was incredibly tight. The sharp edge of the makeshift tool sliced a shallow cut into my index finger. A warm drop of blood rolled down my knuckle. I ignored it. I pushed the aluminum strip deeper, feeling for the tiny spring-loaded locking powel hidden inside the brass body. I visualized the internal geometry of the lock, an exercise I used to give my first-year engineering students. I found the exact point of resistance. I pressed the aluminum shim hard against the powel and twisted the padlock body sharply to the right. The internal spring surrendered. The shackle popped open with a loud metallic click. The sound echoed in the narrow corridor like a gunshot. I froze completely. I stared at the ceiling, waiting for the sound of Colin leaping out of bed upstairs. I counted 30 seconds in my head. The drone of the television above continued uninterrupted. They had not heard me. Not. I removed the padlock and carefully opened the metal cabinet door. The shelves were lined with orange prescription bottles. I reached for the bottle clearly labeled with Martha's name and her daily blood pressure medication. I unscrewed the white plastic cap and tipped a few pills into the palm of my hand. I brought my hand close to the sliver of moonlight. My blood ran completely cold. Martha had been taking the same blood pressure medication for a decade. Those pills were small, round, and scored down the middle. The pills sitting in my palm were large, oblong, and coated in a thick yellow film. I tilted the bottle toward the light and peeled back the pharmacy sticker Rachel had taped over the side. Beneath the fake label was the original manufacturer text. The medication was not for blood pressure. It was an industrial-strength pharmaceutical sedative, a severe central nervous system depressant typically prescribed for extreme psychiatric episodes. The terrifying truth locked entirely into place. My wife was not suffering from age-related dizziness. She was not clumsily falling down the wooden stairs. Colin and Rachel were deliberately administering massive doses of sedatives to a frail woman. They were chemically inducing her falls. They were intentionally turning our home into a death trap, hoping one of those violent tumbles down the stairs would result in a fatal neck injury. They were executing a slow, agonizing murder to expedite their inheritance, and they were using my trust to cover their tracks. I poured the toxic yellow pills back into the orange bottle and screwed the cap on tight. I closed the metal cabinet door and secured the padlock, making sure it looked entirely undisturbed. The physical investigation was over, but my work for the night had just begun. I turned away from the cabinet and headed straight for the glowing screen of the computer in my study. I needed to move my money, and I needed to do it before the sun came up. I left the utility corridor with the image of those toxic yellow pills burned into my retinas. My heart hammered against my ribs with a violent, irregular rhythm, but my mind was operating with terrifying clarity. I did not return to the downstairs guest room. I moved silently toward my private study at the back of the house. I had designed this room specifically as my sanctuary when I built the addition decades ago. The walls were lined with thick, soundproofing insulation meant to drown out the noise of the television and allow me to draft my architectural blueprints in total peace. Tonight, that soundproofing worked entirely against me. It meant I would not hear Colin or Rachel approaching until they were already turning the brass door handle. I stepped inside the dark room and pulled the heavy door shut, pressing until the latch caught without a single sound. I did not turn on the overhead lights. The only illumination came from the street lamp, filtering through the heavy oak blinds, casting long shadows across my mahogany desk. I sat down in my leather office chair and reached for the power button on the desktop computer. The machine whirred to life. The faint blue glow of the monitor washed over my hands. They were trembling slightly. I took a deep breath and forced my mind to compartmentalize the terror. I approached the glowing screen the same way I would approach a failing structural support column. I needed immediate stabilization, and I needed raw power. My plan was precise and ruthless. I intended to log into my primary checking account, transfer $50,000 to an offshore retainer, and hire a private medical extraction team. I wanted armed professionals to arrive at dawn, break down the master bedroom door, and carry my wife safely out of this nightmare. I also intended to hire a private investigator to monitor Colin and Rachel every second of the day until the police arrived to arrest them. Money is the ultimate weapon in a domestic crisis, and I possessed substantial financial ammunition. The operating system loaded. I opened the web browser and navigated straight to my primary email provider. I needed to retrieve the contact information for a security firm I had consulted years ago regarding a volatile construction site. I typed my email address into the login field. I moved my fingers to the password box and typed the sequence of letters and numbers I had used securely for the past 5 years. It was a complex combination derived from the stress-yield formula of structural steel. I pressed the enter key with absolute confidence. A red banner flashed across the top of the screen. The system abruptly informed me that my password was incorrect. I stared at the error message in the dark. I assumed my trembling fingers had simply made a typographical error. I cleared the field and typed the formula again, deliberately pressing each key with exaggerated precision. I pressed enter. The same red banner appeared. A cold knot formed in my stomach. The system displayed a secondary message stating that my password had been successfully changed 3 days ago. The memory hit me like a physical blow. Colin had offered to update my antivirus software over the weekend, claiming he wanted to protect my files from hackers. I had thanked my son for his help. Instead of protecting my computer, he had systematically locked me out of my own digital communications. I was entirely cut off from my professional network, my friends, and my legal contacts. I abandoned the email portal immediately. I did not have time to mourn the loss of my digital address book. I needed raw capital. I opened a new browser tab and typed the web address for my primary financial institution. This was the fortress holding the wealth I had accumulated over 40 years of grueling labor. It contained the liquid cash, the retirement portfolios, and the massive joint checking account I shared with Martha. I brought up the login screen. I entered my username. I carefully typed the 12-character password. This password had never been written down on any piece of paper. It existed entirely in my mind. I clicked the login button, expecting to see the familiar dashboard of my life savings. The screen refreshed. A bold red lock icon appeared in the center of the monitor. The bank portal denied my access completely. The text below the icon stated that the account credentials had been updated and the old password was no longer valid. The breath caught in my throat. I clicked the link to recover my account. The security system prompted me to answer my secret questions. The first question asked for the name of the street where I grew up. I typed the answer. The system rejected it. I tried the second question, asking for the name of my first dog. I typed the exact spelling. The system rejected it again. Rachel had not merely changed the passwords. She had fundamentally rewritten the security architecture of my entire financial existence. She had erased my history and replaced it with her own. Panic finally breached the walls of my forced calm. I was staring at total financial paralysis. I clicked the final recovery option, desperately requesting a temporary login code to bypass the security questions. The screen transitioned to a two-factor authentication page. The text cheerfully announced that a 6-digit security code had just been sent via text message to the primary mobile device on file. The portal displayed the last 4 digits of the receiving phone number. They were not my digits. I leaned closer to the monitor, squinting at the numbers in the blue light. The realization hit me with devastating force. The digits belonged to the new cellular phone Rachel had purchased last month. She had routed all security alerts, all financial authorizations, and all recovery codes directly to her own device. I sat frozen in my leather chair. I had not just failed to access my money, I had actively tripped a digital wire. I had sent a direct notification to my captors that the prisoner was attempting to escape. The profound silence of the house was suddenly broken. A faint, sharp vibration echoed through the ceiling directly above my head. It was the distinct mechanical buzz of a cell phone receiving a text message in the dead of night. It came directly from the master bedroom. I heard the sudden creak of the bed springs. I heard the heavy thud of footsteps hitting the hardwood floor. The alarm had sounded and the warden was awake. I reached down under the desk and ripped the power cord of the computer directly from the wall socket. The monitor went black, instantly plunging the room back into total darkness. I sat in the pitch-black study listening to the deliberate, terrifying sound of footsteps moving across the ceiling toward the top of the stairs. My financial assets were gone. My communications were severed. The digital blockade was absolute, and my enemies were now hunting me in the dark. The footsteps stopped directly outside the heavy oak door of my study. I remained perfectly still in the dark, holding my breath. The brass doorknob turned slowly with a faint metallic scrape. The door swung open, revealing the illuminated hallway. Rachel stood on the threshold. She did not look like a woman who had just been jolted awake in the middle of the night. She wore a pristine silk robe tied tightly at her waist. In her right hand, she held her cellular phone. The screen glowed with a pale blue light, illuminating the cold, satisfied smile resting on her lips. She reached out and flipped the wall switch. The overhead lights flooded the room with blinding clarity. I sat completely exposed in my leather chair, with the dead computer monitor sitting like a useless block of plastic on my desk. Rachel did not scream. She did not ask me what I was doing. She walked slowly into the room, her bare feet making absolutely no sound on the hardwood floor. She approached my desk and looked down at the thick black power cord lying severed on the carpet. She tilted her head, studying me as if I were a fascinating insect trapped in a glass jar. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I waited for the explosion. I waited for her to yell about my betrayal. Instead, she exuded a terrifying serenity. It was the absolute confidence of a predator that knows the prey has absolutely nowhere left to run. She tapped the screen of her phone with one perfectly manicured fingernail. She informed me that a digital security alert is a very useful tool for managing an elderly relative. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. It was the voice of a warden speaking to an inmate who had just failed a desperate escape attempt. She told me that she received a notification the exact second I tried to reset the banking password. I looked up at her and demanded that she return my financial access immediately. I told her that she was committing federal fraud. Rachel simply laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound that echoed off the soundproof walls. She explained that she had not committed any crimes at all. She reminded me that Colin held a provisional power of attorney, a document I had foolishly signed a year ago when I thought he was just helping me with my taxes. She had taken that document to the bank manager. She had played the role of the weeping, exhausted daughter-in-law. She had convinced the bank that my mental state was deteriorating rapidly and that she needed to secure the assets to pay for my future medical care. She told me that the bank manager actually thanked her for being so proactive in protecting my wealth. She smiled as she recounted the story. She had weaponized my own money against me. She stated that every single dollar I had earned over 40 years of building bridges was now resting safely in an account that required her biometric fingerprint to access. I was financially erased. I gripped the wooden arms of my chair, feeling the solid oak beneath my palms. I needed to anchor myself to reality because the foundation of my life was crumbling beneath me. I told her that my mind was perfectly sharp and that I would walk into the bank tomorrow morning to expose her lies. Rachel leaned across my mahogany desk. She placed her hands flat on the polished wood, invading my personal space. She looked directly into my eyes and delivered the reality of my situation. She pointed out that I had no car keys and no cellular phone. She reminded me that the landline had been disconnected. She told me that if I somehow managed to walk 3 miles to the bank, the teller would simply call the police. And when the police arrived, they would find a confused 72-year-old man wandering the streets in the middle of the night. They would call his loving son to come take him home. The trap was mathematically perfect. She had calculated every variable and sealed every exit. I realized the scope of her engineering. While I was focused on the physical locks on the doors, she had built a psychological prison around my identity. She had spent the last 2 years planting seeds of doubt out in the minds of our neighbors, our doctors, and our friends. She had laid the groundwork for my institutionalization long before I ever suspected her of foul play. I asked her what she wanted. I offered to sign the house over to them if they would just leave me and Martha alone. Rachel shook her head slowly. She straightened her posture, looking down at me with absolute contempt. She stated that she already had the house. She already had the money. She did not need my permission for anything. She walked around the desk and stood right beside my chair. She lowered her voice to a harsh whisper. She told me that my behavior at the dental clinic had accelerated their timeline. She claimed that my refusal to accept Martha's clumsy nature proved I was becoming a danger to the household. She reached into the pocket of her silk robe and pulled out a glossy brochure. She dropped it onto my desk. The cover showed an elderly man staring blankly out a window. It was a state-run memory care facility located 50 miles away. Rachel informed me that she had already paid the deposit. She told me that the facility specializes in patients with severe dementia and combative tendencies. The doors lock from the outside. The patients are heavily medicated for their own safety. She leaned down until her face was inches from mine. She told me that the transport van arrives on Friday morning to take me away. She promised me that once I was locked inside that ward, I would never see my wife again. She said the orderlies would strap me to a bed if I tried to tell them I was a retired engineer. They would inject me with the very same sedatives they were feeding to Martha. My mind would slowly dissolve in a chemical fog while she and Colin sold my house and spent my money. Rachel turned her back on me and walked out of the study. She closed the heavy oak door, pulling it shut until the latch clicked. I sat alone in the bright room, staring at the glossy brochure. The trap was completely closed. The walls had collapsed inward. I had less than 72 hours to save my wife and reclaim my life. Wednesday morning arrived with the heavy finality of a prison sentence. The sun rose over the manicured lawns of my affluent neighborhood, but absolutely no light penetrated the suffocating atmosphere of my own house. I sat at the kitchen island, drinking black coffee in complete silence. Rachel had already confiscated my remaining keys and locked the deadbolt on the front door from the inside. She moved around the kitchen with the arrogant confidence of a conquering general. At exactly 8 o'clock, the doorbell chimed. Rachel walked past me without a single word and opened the heavy wooden door. A woman in crisp white medical scrubs stepped into the foyer. She carried a heavy canvas tote bag and wore a laminated identification badge clipped to her collar. Rachel introduced her as Nurse Thompson. I stood up from my wooden stool and analyzed the new arrival. After 40 years of managing massive construction sites and volatile contractors, I know exactly how to read people. Nurse Thompson did not possess the exhausted, compassionate eyes of a dedicated healthcare professional. She possessed the cold, calculating gaze of a mercenary. She did not ask a single question about my wife and her medical history. She did not request to see any previous clinical notes. She simply accepted a thick white envelope full of cash from Rachel and slipped it directly into her pocket. The chain of command was instantly and silently established. Nurse Thompson was not hired to monitor the declining health of an elderly woman. She was hired to ensure my absolute physical isolation. Rachel turned to me and announced the new household regulations with a terrifying calmness. I was strictly forbidden from climbing the main staircase under any circumstances. If I attempted to visit my own wife, Nurse Thompson was explicitly instructed to physically restrain me and call the police to report a violent domestic disturbance. I was confined entirely to the ground floor of the house I had built. I accepted this devastating decree with a hollow nod. I knew that fighting them directly in the kitchen would only accelerate my forced transfer to the state-run memory care facility. I had precisely 48 hours before the medical transport van arrived on Friday morning to take me away forever. The ticking clock in my head was deafening. Every second that passed was a structural support crumbling beneath my feet. I needed a window of opportunity, and I knew I could only find it outside the fortified walls of my own house. The opportunity finally materialized at 2 in the afternoon. Rachel left the house in my sedan to attend a social luncheon at the country club, leaving Nurse Thompson in absolute control. The nurse sat on my expensive leather sofa, scrolling endlessly on her cellular phone. She looked up at the clock and abruptly announced that the doctor had prescribed 30 minutes of mandatory cardiovascular activity to combat my supposed mental decline. She ordered me to put on my coat for a supervised walk around the neighborhood. I retrieved my heavy wool coat from the closet and grabbed my wooden walking cane. We stepped out onto the concrete sidewalk. The afternoon air was crisp and biting, but it tasted like absolute freedom. Nurse Thompson did not walk beside me. She walked 2 precise paces behind my right shoulder. It was not the position of a friendly companion. It was the exact tactical position of a prison guard, ensuring the inmate did not alter his designated path. I walked with a slow, deliberate shuffle, playing the role of the broken and confused old man they desperately wanted me to be. I leaned heavily on my wooden cane, taking short, uneven steps that dragged against the concrete. In reality, my mind was operating at maximum velocity. I analyzed the geometry of our route with surgical precision. We were walking down the main avenue, approaching the small commercial district at the edge of the residential neighborhood. I knew every alleyway, every delivery entrance, and every blind spot in a 4-block radius. We passed the local bakery and approached the old brick facade of the neighborhood hardware store. This was my calculated extraction point. I needed to create a physical distraction substantial enough to break her line of sight for exactly 60 seconds. As we reached the front of the hardware store, I initiated the structural failure. I planted my right foot firmly on the concrete sidewalk and intentionally buckled my knee inward with violent force. I let out a sharp, guttural gasp of pain that echoed loudly down the quiet street. I allowed my full body weight to collapse against the rough red bricks of the building. I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the cold pavement, gripping my knee with both hands. I squeezed my eyes shut and forced my breathing into rapid, shallow pants. I rocked back and forth, moaning in manufactured agony. Nurse Thompson stopped immediately. She did not drop to her knees to assess my injury or offer any medical assistance. She stood over me, looking profoundly annoyed by the sudden public spectacle. She checked her phone and sighed heavily. She ordered me to stand up and stop acting like a child. I looked up at her, squinting in the bright afternoon sunlight. I let my voice tremble perfectly, mimicking the sheer panic of an elderly man experiencing a severe medical crisis. I told her that my advanced arthritis had triggered a massive muscle spasm in my leg. I told her I could not move my joints and that I was feeling dangerously lightheaded. I pointed a shaking finger toward the glass doors of the hardware store. I begged her to go inside and buy me a cold bottle of water from the cooler near the cash register. I promised her that if I just had some water and 2 minutes to rest, I would be able to walk back to the house without causing any more trouble. Nurse Thompson weighed her options carefully. She clearly did not want to drag my dead weight down the street and draw attention from the passing cars. She looked at the glass doors, then looked down at me, sitting pathetically on the concrete. She sternly ordered me not to move a single muscle and walked toward the entrance. The exact second the glass doors of the hardware store closed behind her, my arthritic agony vanished completely. The ticking clock in my mind reached 0, and the alarm sounded. I did not use my wooden cane to stand up. I left it lying in the middle of the sidewalk as a completely useless prop. I pushed off the brick wall with explosive strength. I moved with a speed and agility that would have absolutely terrified my son. I ducked instantly into the narrow service alley running parallel to the hardware store. The alley was dark and lined with rusted steel dumpsters and stacked wooden delivery pallets. I did not look back at the street. I navigated the cluttered space with the precision of an engineer, knowing exactly where to place my feet to avoid making a single sound. I reached the back of the alley and slipped behind a towering stack of cardboard boxes, pressing my back flat against the cold metal of a delivery door. I had successfully breached the perimeter. I was outside the digital blockade, and I was entirely unsupervised. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out 2 quarters I had stolen from the kitchen jar that morning. I had exactly 3 minutes before Nurse Thompson walked out of that store, realized I was gone, and triggered the neighborhood alarm. I needed a public telephone, and I needed to initiate a weapon of mass financial destruction before the sun went down. I stood in the damp shadows of the service alley, listening to the faint hum of traffic from the main avenue. My heart beat a steady rhythm against my ribs. I had exactly 3 minutes before Nurse Thompson raised the alarm. I moved past a towering stack of wooden delivery pallets and spotted a young delivery driver sitting on the rear bumper of a heavy commercial bread truck. He wore a faded gray uniform and stared blankly at the screen of his cellular phone. I approached him quickly. I did not have time for polite introductions or elaborate fabricated stories. I reached into my heavy wool coat pocket and pulled out the 2 silver quarters I had taken from the kitchen jar that morning. I held them out to the young man. I told him that I was locked out of my house and facing a severe medical emergency. I offered him the coins and the heavy gold retirement watch on my left wrist in exchange for exactly 2 minutes of his phone time. The driver looked at my expensive clothing and my desperate eyes. He refused the watch and the coins. He simply unlocked the device, handed it to me, and turned his back to give me total privacy. I gripped the thin plastic rectangle. My hands were completely steady now. I dialed a 10-digit number I had committed to memory over 3 decades ago. It was the private direct line to the senior partner desk at the most ruthless corporate litigation firm in the entire city. The line rang twice before a polished female voice answered. She began the standard corporate greeting, demanding to know the nature of my business and my company affiliation before she would connect me. I did not allow her to finish her rehearsed script. I instructed her to transfer the line to Vance Crawford, immediately. I told her to inform him that the chief structural architect of the Downtown Transit Authority collapse was calling to cash in his final favor. The receptionist hesitated for a fraction of a second. I heard the rapid clicking of a computer keyboard. A moment later, the line clicked and transferred into the private executive office. The voice that came through the speaker was cold and incredibly sharp. Vance Crawford demanded to know who was bypassing his strict security protocols. I took a deep breath of the cold alley air. I said his name clearly. I told him it was Henry, and that the foundational pillars of my life were cracking. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute and profound. When Vance spoke again, the rigid corporate hostility had vanished completely. He sounded like a veteran soldier hearing the voice of an old commander. He asked me where I had been hiding for the last 5 years. He reminded me that the last time we spoke, we were standing in a federal courtroom, systematically dismantling a corrupt steel supplier who had tried to frame me for a massive bridge collapse. He said we had buried those corporate executives under a mountain of irrefutable evidence. I told him I did not have time to reminisce about the Transit Authority trial today. I told him I was currently standing in a dirty alley, hiding from a mercenary nurse hired by my own son. I explained that my family had initiated a hostile corporate takeover of my personal life and my home. Vance did not ask any useless emotional questions. He is an apex predator in the legal world who operates purely on logic and leverage. He instantly shifted into his tactical mindset. He asked for the exact current status of my financial assets. I told him Colin and Rachel had successfully breached the primary accounts and seized the liquid capital. I told him they had disconnected my communications, isolated my wife, and were actively poisoning her with industrial psychiatric sedatives to hasten her death and secure the estate. I heard Vance exhale sharply into the receiver. He recognized the terrifying severity of the structural failure. He asked what ammunition we still possessed in our arsenal. I gave him the precise coordinates of our hidden financial armory. I told him about the subterranean safety deposit box located at the central downtown bank branch. I reminded him that we registered that specific box under Martha maiden name 30 years ago, specifically to shield our emergency funds from corporate discovery during the massive Transit Authority lawsuit. I explained that Colin and Rachel knew absolutely nothing about its existence because it was never digitized or connected to my modern accounts. I instructed Vance to access the box using his duplicate key held in his firm's secure vault. I told him the metal box contained $3 million in untraceable government bearer bonds and the original ironclad documents for the blind trust I had established. I spoke rapidly, detailing the exact legal parameters of the trust to ensure he understood the weapon we were deploying. I explained that the trust held the ultimate deed to my property and contained a strict, immediate reversion clause. I told Vance that Colin held a provisional power of attorney, but the trust documents in that box would completely nullify his authority the exact moment they were filed with a state judge. Vance processed the complex legal strategy instantly without needing a single clarification. He told me the bearer bonds would provide untraceable liquid cash to hire the best private security and medical transport teams in the state without alerting the bank monitors. He told me he would pull his entire legal team off their current corporate cases and mobilize them immediately to prepare the injunctions. He asked where I would be while he assembled the legal strike force. I told him I had to return to the prison. I explained that if I disappeared now, Colin and Rachel would simply murder Martha and flee the state with the money they had already stolen. I had to maintain the illusion of my own defeat to keep them comfortable and arrogant. I told him that Colin and Rachel had scheduled a medical transport van to take me to a locked memory care ward on Friday morning. I told Vance he had exactly 48 hours to arm the financial bomb and detonate it directly inside my living room. I gave him my final explicit instructions to show absolutely no mercy to my son or my daughter-in-law. Vance promised me that by Friday morning, Colin and Rachel would own nothing but their own profound regret. I hung up the phone. I erased the call history from the device. I handed the phone back to the confused delivery driver and walked out of the dark alley. I stepped back onto the bright concrete sidewalk, ready to surrender myself to the warden and wait for the explosion. I walked back to the hardware store, leaning heavily on my wooden cane. Nurse Thompson was standing outside the glass doors holding a plastic bottle of water. Her face was flushed with anger. She thrust the water bottle into my chest and ordered me to drink it quickly. She did not suspect a single thing. She believed I had been sitting against the brick wall the entire time. I drank the water and allowed her to march me back to the house. I dragged my feet against the concrete, maintaining the illusion of absolute physical defeat. When we finally crossed the threshold of my home, Rachel was still absent. Nurse Thompson ordered me to sit in the living room while she went to the kitchen to prepare her own lunch. I told her I needed to use the downstairs bathroom to wash the dirt from my hands. She waved me away with a look of pure disgust. I stepped into the small half-bathroom located under the main staircase and locked the heavy wooden door. I turned the brass handles of the sink, allowing the water to run at maximum volume to mask any sound. I did not look at my exhausted reflection in the mirror. I dropped to my knees on the cold tile floor. I reached behind the porcelain base of the toilet, feeling for a small hollow space in the wall cavity that I had left unsealed during the construction of the house 20 years ago. My fingers brushed against a thick plastic waterproof bag hidden deep within the shadows. I pulled it out. Inside the bag was a prepaid cellular phone wrapped in a dry cloth. I had purchased this device 5 years ago during a highly volatile construction dispute, intending to use it as a secure emergency line. I had never needed it until today. I pressed the power button and prayed the lithium battery still held a charge. The small screen flickered to life, illuminating the dark bathroom with a pale green glow. I had a full signal. I dialed Vance Crawford direct line again. He answered on the first ring. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He immediately confirmed that he had successfully bypassed the bank security protocols and accessed the subterranean safe deposit box. He told me the $3 million in untraceable government bearer bonds were now sitting safely in his armored briefcase. He confirmed that the original blind trust documents were pristine and legally ironclad. He stated that he had the absolute power to legally crush my son and sever his provisional power of attorney. The financial weapon was fully armed and ready to deploy. I felt a massive wave of relief wash over my chest. I told Vance to initiate the legal filings immediately, to freeze my stolen bank accounts, and dispatch the private medical extraction team to my house. I was ready to end the nightmare. Vance did not share my relief. His voice dropped to a low, terrifying register. He told me to sit down on the bathroom floor. He stated that while his paralegals were preparing the injunctions, he had ordered his senior associates to run a comprehensive background check on all recent legal filings in the county court system, bearing my name or Colin name. Vance told me he had discovered a catastrophic structural failure in our timeline. Colin had not simply stolen my banking passwords and hired a corrupt private nurse. He had engaged the services of a predatory family law attorney known for exploiting loopholes in the probate system. Vance revealed that Colin had filed an emergency ex parte petition with the state Supreme Court at exactly 9 o'clock that very morning. I sat on the cold bathroom tiles, listening to the water rushing into the sink. I asked Vance to explain the exact legal parameters of an ex parte petition. He explained the mechanism with surgical precision. He told me that an ex parte filing allows one party to present evidence to a judge without the other party being present or even notified. Colin had walked into a closed courtroom and presented a fabricated narrative to a sitting judge. Vance told me that Colin had submitted sworn affidavits claiming I was suffering from severe violent dementia. Colin had provided forged medical records detailing my supposed physical attacks on my wife. He had painted a terrifying picture of an elderly man actively destroying his own family and his own fortune. Vance delivered the most devastating news with absolute clarity. He told me the judge had reviewed the fabricated evidence and granted a temporary order of emergency guardianship. The court had officially declared me legally incompetent. I felt the air leave my lungs completely. I was no longer an autonomous human being in the eyes of the law. I was legally stripped of my human rights. I could not sign a contract. I could not hire a lawyer. I could not refuse medical treatment. I could not even choose where I slept at night. Colin had weaponized the entire judicial system against me. He had built a legal fortress around his crimes, and the state was now acting as his private security force. I gripped the edge of the porcelain sink, feeling the cold reality of my situation. I asked Vance if the blind trust documents could override the judge order. Vance explained the brutal reality of the legal siege. He told me that the blind trust was incredibly powerful, but it relied on my capacity to execute its clauses. If the temporary guardianship was finalized and made permanent, Colin would gain absolute control over every legal entity bearing my name. He would have the authority to dissolve the blind trust, seize the bearer bonds, and liquidate the entire estate. Vance told me that Colin had scheduled a mandatory psychiatric evaluation for Thursday evening to finalize the court order. That evaluation was the final nail in my coffin. Vance warned me that if a licensed psychiatrist examined me and submitted a formal report corroborating, Colin Lies the judge would make the guardianship permanent on Friday morning. The state-run memory care facility would arrive with a court order and police escort to drag me out of my own home. Once I was locked inside that ward, Colin would have unchecked access to Martha. He would increase her dosage of the industrial sedatives until her heart finally gave out. The legal siege was not just about stealing my money. It was a perfectly engineered mechanism for murder. I stared at the green screen of the prepaid phone. The fear that had been paralyzing me suddenly evaporated completely. It was replaced by a cold, calculating fury. I was a structural engineer. I knew that every fortress has a weak point. I asked Vance what we needed to break the siege. Vance told me we needed undeniable physical proof of the poison. We needed an explosive piece of evidence that would instantly completely discredit the corrupt psychiatrist and prove to the police that Colin was actively attempting to murder my wife. He told me the bearer bonds and the trust documents were useless unless we could prove the entire premise of the guardianship was built on a criminal conspiracy. I told Vance that Rachel kept the toxic yellow pills locked in a metal cabinet in the utility corridor. I told him I had already bypassed the padlock once. Vance ordered me to extract a sample of those pills before the dinner party on Thursday night. He told me to secure the physical evidence and keep it hidden on my person at all times. He promised me that if I could hold my ground and survive the psychiatric interrogation on Thursday, he would personally arrive with a team of armed federal agents and forensic medical experts to shatter the legal illusion Colin had built. He told me I was entirely on my own until the trap was sprung. He instructed me to destroy the prepaid phone immediately to prevent Rachel from discovering my outside communications. I agreed to the terms of the engagement. I ended the call. I placed the phone on the tile floor and crushed it beneath the heel of my heavy leather shoe. I picked up the shattered plastic and electronic components and flushed them down the toilet, watching the water carry away my only lifeline to the outside world. I turned off the sink faucet and unlocked the bathroom door. I stepped back out into the silent house. I was officially a ghost in the eyes of the law. I had no rights, no money, and no freedom. But I had a target. The domestic abuse had escalated into a full legal siege, and I was absolutely prepared to burn the entire structure to the ground to save the woman I loved. I walked out of the downstairs bathroom and returned to the living room. Nurse Thompson was sitting on the leather sofa eating a sandwich and scrolling through the television channels. She did not even look in my direction. I sat down heavily in my armchair and placed my wooden walking cane across my lap. This cane was not a standard medical device purchased from a pharmacy. I had carved it myself 10 years ago from a solid piece of Brazilian mahogany. As an engineer, I appreciate objects that serve multiple purposes. The heavy brass handle of the cane was threaded. If you twisted the handle counterclockwise, it unscrewed to reveal a hollow cylindrical chamber hidden inside the thick wooden shaft. I had originally designed the hidden compartment to hold emergency rolled blueprints when walking across active construction sites. Today, that hollow chamber was going to hold the physical evidence required to send my son to federal prison. I needed to secure a sample of the toxic yellow sedatives locked in the utility corridor. Vance Crawford had made it absolutely clear that without the physical pills, the judge would finalize the guardianship order on Friday, and I would be locked in a memory care ward forever. I also needed to replace the stolen pills to ensure Colin and Rachel did not realize their chemical weapon had been compromised. During my morning confinement to the kitchen, I had managed to pocket a handful of over-the-counter vitamin supplements from the pantry. They were large oblong and coated in a yellow film that perfectly matched the visual profile of the industrial sedatives. I sat in the armchair, gripping the mahogany cane, and waited for the mercenary nurse to make a mistake. My opportunity arrived exactly 45 minutes later. Nurse Thompson received a phone call on her cellular device. She answered it, and her tone instantly shifted to a hushed, urgent whisper. She stood up from the sofa and walked toward the enclosed sunroom at the back of the house, sliding the heavy glass door shut behind her to secure her privacy. I did not waste a single second. I stood up and moved silently across the living room carpet toward the utility corridor. I retrieved the folded aluminum shim from my pocket. My hands did not tremble this time. I approached the white metal medicine cabinet and gripped the heavy brass padlock. I slid the makeshift aluminum tool into the narrow gap of the shackle, feeling for the internal spring mechanism. I twisted the padlock body sharply, and the shackle popped open with a familiar metallic click. I removed the lock and opened the cabinet door. The orange prescription bottle sat exactly where I had left it. I reached out and grabbed it. I twisted off the white plastic cap. I poured 10 of the toxic yellow sedatives into the palm of my left hand. I immediately reached into my trousers pocket with my right hand and retrieved the yellow vitamin supplements. I dropped the harmless vitamins into the orange prescription bottle, replacing the exact volume of pills I had just stolen. I screwed the plastic cap back onto the bottle. The visual illusion was flawless. Anyone looking inside that bottle would simply see a cluster of yellow oblong pills. I placed the bottle back onto the metal shelf exactly where I had found it. I needed to secure the cabinet and conceal the stolen poison before Nurse Thompson finished her private conversation. I closed the white metal door and threaded the brass padlock back through the latch. I pressed the shackle down until it locked securely into place. I turned my attention to the wooden walking cane leaning against the wall. I gripped the thick mahogany shaft with my left hand and grabbed the heavy brass handle with my right. I twisted the handle forcefully, counterclockwise. The hidden threads released with a soft grinding sound. I pulled the handle away, exposing the dark hollow chamber inside the wood. I carefully dropped the 10 toxic yellow sedatives into the cylindrical void one by one. They rattled softly against the wooden interior. I stuffed a small piece of tissue paper into the hole to pack the pills tightly and prevent them from making any noise when I walked. I replaced the brass handle and twisted it clockwise until it was perfectly flush with the mahogany shaft. The physical evidence was entirely secured. I was holding the key to my freedom and the instrument of my son's total destruction directly in my hand. I walked out of the utility corridor and sat back down in my armchair in the living room. I arranged my features into a mask of exhausted defeat. I closed my eyes and slowed my breathing, preparing to play the role of the docile prisoner for the rest of the afternoon. 10 minutes later, Nurse Thompson slid the glass door of the sunroom open and walked back into the living room. She looked at the clock on the wall and let out a heavy sigh. She announced that it was time to prepare the afternoon medication for my wife. I kept my eyes closed, feigning sleep, but every muscle in my body coiled with intense anticipation. I listened to the heavy squeak of her rubber-soled shoes moving across the hardwood floor toward the utility corridor. I heard the distinct metallic jingle as she pulled the brass key to the padlock from her pocket. I heard the lock click open. I heard the white metal door swing outward on its hinges. I waited for her to retrieve the bottle, pour the fake pills into a paper cup, and walk upstairs. Instead, I heard a sudden, sharp intake of breath. The silence that followed was agonizing. It was not the casual silence of someone performing a routine task. It was the rigid, terrifying silence of a predator detecting a subtle disruption in its environment. Nurse Thompson was a corrupt mercenary, but she was incredibly observant. Rachel had undoubtedly instructed her to maintain strict inventory control over the sedatives. I listened intently. I heard the sound of the plastic bottle being placed back onto the metal shelf. Then I heard the rapid, frantic tapping of fingers against a glass screen. She was not preparing the medication. She was dialing her phone. She did not step out into the hallway to make the call. She spoke directly from the utility corridor, her voice dropping to an urgent, panicked whisper. I heard her say my son's name. I heard her tell Colin that he needed to come home immediately. She explained that the alignment of the prescription bottles inside the locked cabinet had been altered. She stated that she had meticulously arranged the labels to face outward at a specific angle before she sat down to eat her lunch. She told Colin that the bottle containing the heavy sedatives had been rotated exactly 90 degrees to the left. She also noted a fresh, microscopic scratch on the brass casing of the padlock, left behind by my aluminum shim. She told my son that someone had breached the medical supply and tampered with the inventory. I sat frozen in my armchair, gripping the brass handle of my wooden cane. The blood drained completely from my face. My perfectly calculated timeline had just violently collapsed. I had successfully secured the physical evidence, but my infiltration had been detected. The digital blockade was absolute. The legal siege was finalized, and now the physical trap was springing shut early. Colin was currently miles away at his corporate office, but I knew he would abandon everything and race back to the house to protect his chemical weapon. When he arrived, he would not wait for the scheduled psychiatric evaluation on Thursday night. He would realize I was actively resisting his hostile takeover. He would force the issue immediately. He would call the private psychiatric transport team tonight, drag me out of my chair, and lock me in the memory care facility before the sun came up. I looked at the front door, knowing the deadbolt was locked from the inside. I looked at the wooden stairs leading up to the master bedroom where my wife was trapped. I had the poison in my hand, but my time had completely run out. The final confrontation was no longer a distant event on the horizon. It was speeding toward my front door right now. Thursday evening descended upon the house like a heavy velvet curtain hiding an executioner block. The atmosphere inside my home had completely transformed since my catastrophic discovery in the utility corridor. Colin and Rachel were no longer acting like overwhelmed caregivers dealing with a stressful burden. They were operating with the frantic, excited energy of predators preparing for a massive feast. They had hired a private catering company to prepare a lavish dinner party. Strangers in crisp white uniforms moved rapidly through my kitchen, carrying silver trays of roasted meats and expensive hot appetizers. The dining room table, which I had built with my own hands from a single slab of reclaimed walnut, was covered in imported silk linens and illuminated by towering crystal candelabras. The entire house smelled of rich, heavy food and expensive floral arrangements. It was a grotesque parody of a celebration. They had told the catering staff and the invited guests that tonight was a special anniversary dinner to honor my long marriage to Martha. I sat in the shadows of the living room, gripping my hollow mahogany cane, knowing the absolute truth. Tonight was not a celebration of my life or my marriage. It was the meticulously staged theater of my legal execution. Colin wanted to finalize the emergency guardianship order, and he needed an audience to witness my supposed mental collapse. I watched the bottom of the main staircase, waiting for the warden to make her appearance. Rachel descended the wooden steps, moving with a slow, deliberate elegance that made my stomach churn with violent disgust. She wore a stunning, dark velvet evening gown that swept across the hardwood floors. But it was not the dress that caught my attention. It was the brilliant flash of light reflecting off her throat and her wrists. Rachel was wearing Martha Diamond tennis bracelet and the heavy platinum emerald necklace I had purchased for my wife on our 30th wedding anniversary. She had not simply locked my wife in an upstairs bedroom and chemically sedated her. She had stripped the unconscious woman of her most precious personal possessions and draped them over her own skin. Rachel walked into the living room and poured herself a glass of deep red wine from a crystal decanter. She caught me staring at the emerald resting against her collarbone. She did not look away. She did not display a single ounce of shame. She raised her glass toward me with a slow, mocking smile. She was silently establishing her absolute dominance. She was showing me that the transfer of power was already complete. The queen was deposed, and the usurper was now wearing the crown jewels. I gripped the brass handle of my cane, feeling the 10 toxic pills hidden safely inside the wood. I forced my face to remain perfectly blank, swallowing the white-hot fury burning in my throat. At precisely 7 o'clock, the heavy brass knocker on the front door sounded. The trap was officially springing open. Colin rushed to the foyer wearing a tailored charcoal suit and a bright, welcoming smile. He opened the door to admit the first wave of guests. They were wealthy neighbors, corporate colleagues, and affluent members of the local country club. They walked into my home laughing loudly, handing expensive bottles of champagne to the catering staff. They looked around the beautifully decorated dining room, completely oblivious to the fact that they were stepping into an active crime scene. Then the front door opened again to admit a man who did not fit the festive profile. He was a tall, thin man wearing a drab brown suit, carrying a thick leather portfolio and a digital tablet. Rachel greeted him at the door with exaggerated warmth. She introduced him to the room as a historical architecture enthusiast who simply wanted to admire the unique craftsmanship of our home. I recognized the lie instantly. The man did not look at the crown molding or the structural arches I had designed. He looked directly at the antique Persian rugs, the original oil paintings hanging on the walls, and the massive silver service set resting on the sideboard. He began typing rapidly on his digital tablet, making calculated financial assessments. He was not an enthusiast. He was an elite estate appraiser. Colin and Rachel were not even waiting for the judge to sign the final guardianship papers tomorrow morning. They were actively inventorying my wealth, cataloging my life work, so they could liquidate the assets the exact second the gavel fell. The appraiser walked past my chair, looking at me as if I were just another piece of old, dusty furniture waiting to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. I watched him place a small red circular sticker on the back of my antique grandfather clock. He was literally tagging my possessions right in front of my face. The final guest arrived 15 minutes later, slipping quietly through the front door, while the rest of the room was distracted by the overflowing champagne tower. He was a short, powerfully built man, with a thick silver beard and cold, analytical eyes. He wore a tweed jacket and carried a small black leather notebook. Colin rushed to his side, shaking his hand with a desperate, eager energy. Colin guided the man through the crowded room, introducing him to the wealthy neighbors as an old family friend and a retired university professor. I knew immediately that this was the executioner. This was the corrupt private psychiatric evaluator Colin had hired to rubber stamp the state guardianship petition. The psychiatrist did not join the loud conversations or partake in the lavish appetizers. He stood near the edge of the room, sipping a glass of sparkling water, keeping his back to the wall. He observed the entire party with predatory focus, but his cold eyes kept returning to me, sitting silently in my armchair. He was studying my posture, my breathing, and my complete lack of social engagement. He was already formulating his fabricated medical report. He was waiting for the perfect moment to approach me, provoke a violent reaction, and document my supposed insanity in front of 30 wealthy witnesses. The absolute brilliance of Colin's strategy became horrifyingly clear. If I reacted with justified anger to the appraiser stealing my furniture or Rachel wearing my wife's jewelry, the psychiatrist would document my aggressive paranoia. If I tried to warn the guests that my wife was being poisoned, the psychiatrist would document my severe delusions. The trap was perfectly engineered. Any movement I made would trigger the snare, and prove to the court that I was completely incompetent. I was a structural engineer caught in a flawlessly designed cage of psychological manipulation. Rachel moved to the center of the living room holding a silver spoon and a crystal champagne flute. She tapped the glass gently, cutting through the loud chatter of the party. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to the beautiful hostess draped in stolen emeralds. Rachel delivered a masterful performance. She thanked everyone for coming to honor the legacy of this beautiful family. She spoke about the tragedy of aging and the heavy noble burden of caring for parents in their twilight years. She looked at me with an expression of profound manufactured pity. She wiped a fake tear from her eye as the wealthy guests murmured in sympathetic agreement. She commanded the catering staff to open the dining room doors and invited the guests to take their seats for the feast. The attendees moved like cattle toward the long walnut table, eager to consume the food bought with my stolen money. Colin walked over to my armchair. He leaned down until his mouth was right next to my ear. He smelled of expensive cologne and sheer adrenaline. He whispered that I needed to behave perfectly tonight, or the medical transport van would arrive 12 hours early to drag me away in the dark. He gripped my arm and pulled me roughly out of the chair. I stood up, leaning heavily on my hollow wooden cane. I let my shoulders slump, adopting the physical posture of a broken, terrified old man. I walked slowly toward the dining room, surrounded by my enemies, the appraiser and the corrupt psychiatrist. I knew I had to survive the next 2 hours without making a single mistake. The trap was fully prepared, the bait was set, and the execution was about to begin. I sat at the head of the massive walnut dining table, but I was no longer the master of the house. I was the spectacle. The caterers poured expensive vintage wine into crystal glasses, while the wealthy guests tore into roasted duck and seared vegetables. Above the loud clinking of silverware and the obnoxious laughter of Colin corporate friends, I heard a distinct, repetitive sound. It was the sharp tearing of paper followed by a firm slap against wood. I shifted my gaze slightly without turning my head. The estate appraiser was moving methodically through the adjoining sitting room. He was not even trying to be discreet. He held a roll of bright red circular auction stickers in his left hand and a digital tablet in his right. I watched him stop in front of the hand-carved mahogany credenza I had imported from Italy for Martha's 40th birthday. He ran his hand over the polished wood, typed a number into his tablet, and slapped a bright red sticker directly onto the center of the drawer. He moved to the bronze statue of a rearing horse I had received as a retirement gift from my engineering firm. Another tier of paper. Another red sticker. He walked over to the vintage record player Martha and I had purchased during our honeymoon in Chicago. He did not even pause to admire the craftsmanship before placing a sticker on the glass lid. He was systematically dismantling the physical evidence of my entire life right in front of my face. He was pricing my memories while the people eating my food watched with casual indifference. The urge to stand up and break my heavy wooden cane across the appraiser back was almost overwhelming. The adrenaline pumped violently through my veins, demanding physical action, but I kept my hands resting weakly on my lap. I allowed my shoulders to slump forward until my chest was almost touching the edge of the table. I forced my hands to shake slightly when I reached for my water glass. I knew I was being hunted. The corrupt private psychiatrist was seated directly across from me. He did not eat. He did not engage in the loud conversations about golf courses or stock portfolios. He simply watched my every micro-expression. He was waiting for the exact moment my pride overrode my discipline. He wanted me to shout at the appraiser. He wanted me to demand respect. If I showed a single spark of lucid rage, he would document it as a violent, paranoid outburst, confirming Colin fabricated legal narrative. I swallowed my pride. I chewed the expensive food that tasted like ash in my mouth and stared blankly at the floral centerpiece. I was a suspension bridge absorbing a massive seismic shock, transferring the destructive energy deep into my foundation to prevent a total collapse. Rachel realized that the appraiser was not provoking the reaction she needed. She decided to escalate the psychological warfare to a new devastating level. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the silk tablecloth, causing the stolen emerald necklace to catch the light of the crystal chandelier. She adopted a tone of profound, theatrical sorrow. She raised her voice just enough to ensure the entire table stopped talking and focused entirely on her. She told the guests that tonight was a bittersweet occasion. She claimed that while they were celebrating a long marriage, the reality of our daily life was a tragic nightmare. Rachel looked at me with fake tears welling in her beautifully painted eyes. She told the affluent crowd that my mind was completely deteriorating. She fabricated a story with terrifying conviction. She claimed that just yesterday I had wandered out into the street wearing nothing but my pajamas, screaming that I was late for a construction project that ended 20 years ago. She said Colin had to physically drag me back into the house while I fought him with the terrifying strength of a deranged man. The guests gasped in synchronized horror. They looked at me with a sickening mixture of pity and absolute disgust. Rachel did not stop there. She knew exactly where to twist the knife to inflict maximum emotional damage. She brought Martha into her web of lies. She told the guests that the hardest part of the decline was watching me forget my own wife. She claimed that I frequently walked into the master bedroom and demanded to know who the strange woman sleeping in my bed was. She painted herself and Colin as exhausted heroic martyrs, sacrificing their own youth and happiness to protect a violent, confused old man and his bedridden wife. She told the table that they had finally made the agonizing decision to transfer me to a specialized medical facility for my own safety. She said it broke her heart, but they simply could not manage my aggressive outbursts anymore. She wiped another fake tear from her cheek and took a sip of her dark red wine. She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Her skin was cold. Her touch was a physical violation. She squeezed my fingers and told the guests that she just hoped I would remember how much she and Colin loved me before my mind faded to total black. The level of sheer, audacious cruelty was breathtaking. She was burying me alive using my own dining table as the graveyard. The wealthy neighbors nodded sympathetically, murmuring their support for Rachel's incredible bravery. One of the corporate wives actually reached out and patted Rachel's shoulder, praising her absolute devotion to the family. The psychiatrist across the table leaned forward slightly, his pen hovering over his black leather notebook. He was waiting for the explosion. He was waiting for me to pull my hand away, call her a liar, and expose the entire fraud to the room. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped animal. The 10 toxic yellow pills hidden inside my mahogany cane felt incredibly heavy pressing against my leg under the table. I focused all my mental energy on the smooth brass handle of that cane. I reminded myself that anger is a completely useless emotion in a structural collapse. Only calculated geometry and immense patience can save you. If I exploded now, I would be locked in a padded cell by morning, and Martha would be dead by the end of the month. I had to let them win this pathetic battle to annihilate them in the impending war. I did not pull my hand away from Rachel's cold grip. I did not raise my voice to defend my honor. I looked at her with wide, vacant eyes. I let my jaw drop open slightly, allowing a small line of drool to pool at the corner of my mouth. I patted her hand with my trembling fingers and whispered a confused apology about losing my car keys that made absolutely no sense in the context of her speech. The performance was utterly flawless. The wealthy guests looked away immediately, deeply uncomfortable with the pathetic display of cognitive ruin in the middle of a dinner party. Rachel pulled her hand back abruptly, her eyes flashing with a momentary flicker of intense confusion. She had expected a violent fight. She had expected the proud, stubborn engineer to stand up and loudly defend his legacy. Instead, she found a broken, empty shell. The psychiatrist frowned heavily and jotted a quick, dismissive note in his leather ledger. The immediate trap had failed to trigger the violent outburst they so desperately needed for the legal paperwork. The public humiliation had failed to crack my foundation, but the execution was far from over. Colin stood up from his chair at the other end of the long table. His face was tight with immense frustration and poorly concealed rage. He realized the passive torture was not enough to break my spirit. He tapped his crystal wine glass with a silver spoon to command the attention of the room. He announced with a strained smile that the visiting professor needed to conduct a brief standard medical evaluation in the living room to ensure my medication levels were correct. Colin walked over to my chair and grabbed my shoulder, hauling me upward with brutal force. The theatrical dinner was finished. The active psychiatric interrogation was about to begin, and I was walking directly into the center of the snare. Colin pushed me down into the deep leather armchair in the corner of the living room. The heavy fabric swallowed my frame, making me look frail and entirely powerless. The rest of the dinner party remained in the dining room, laughing over their expensive desserts. The sliding wooden doors were pulled shut, isolating us completely from the festive noise. The corrupt psychiatrist pulled up a straight-backed wooden dining chair and sat directly in front of me. He positioned himself so our knees were practically touching, invading my personal space to assert immediate psychological dominance. He did not offer a warm greeting or a reassuring smile. He opened his black leather notebook and clicked his silver pen. I looked at his eyes and saw nothing but cold financial calculation. He was being paid a massive sum of money to legally erase my autonomy, and he wanted to finish the job quickly. Colin stood right behind the psychiatrist, crossing his arms over his tailored suit. My son was acting as the physical muscle ready to restrain me the exact second I reacted to the verbal abuse. The interrogation began without a single ounce of medical ethics. The man introduced himself as Dr. Weber, though I knew that title was purchased rather than earned. He started with a rapid-fire sequence of disorienting questions designed to confuse a healthy mind and completely shatter a vulnerable one. He asked me to recite my social security number backward. He demanded to know the exact date of my mother's funeral. He asked me to identify the current prime minister of a foreign country I had never visited. He fired the questions like bullets, leaving absolutely no space for me to process the words before the next demand hit me. I knew exactly what he was doing. It is a classic interrogation technique used to elevate the heart rate and induce panic. A proud man would demand he slow down. An angry man would tell him to go to hell. I did neither. I utilized my engineering background to regulate my physical responses. I slowed my breathing, counting the seconds between inhalations. I let my jaw hang slightly slack. I looked at the floor instead of making eye contact. When I answered, I mumbled a string of numbers that had absolutely nothing to do with my social security. I pretended to struggle with the name of the month. I played the role of a mind lost in a dense, impenetrable fog. Weber jotted down notes with sharp, aggressive strokes of his pen. He was documenting my failure to grasp basic reality. The cognitive tests were merely the warm-up. Weber realized I was not going to become verbally combative over memory puzzles. He shifted his strategy to emotional warfare. As an engineer, I understand that every material has a breaking point. Steel bends before it snaps. Concrete cracks before it crumbles. The human mind is no different. Dr. Weber was actively searching for my stress fractures. He leaned in closer until I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. He lowered his voice into a harsh, accusatory whisper. He brought up my wife. He asked me why I kept hurting Martha. He asked me if I enjoyed pushing her down the stairs. The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The sheer audacity of the accusation made the blood roar in my ears. Colin stood right behind the doctor, watching me with hungry, expectant eyes. They were daring me to defend myself. They wanted me to leap out of the chair and wrap my hands around the doctor's throat. Weber continued his relentless assault. He told me that Rachel was terrified of me. He claimed that I was a violent monster who had lost all capacity for human empathy. He stated that I was a massive burden on my family, and that my own son despised the sight of me. Every single word was a precisely calibrated needle designed to pierce my pride and provoke a violent explosion. The 10 toxic pills hidden in my hollow mahogany cane pressed against my thigh. I knew the exact truth. I knew my son was the monster. The urge to pull out the pills and expose the entire murderous plot right there in the living room was a raging fire in my mind. But I am an architect of structural endurance. I know that if you release the pressure valve too early, the entire system explodes and you lose everything. If I showed them the pills tonight without Vance Crawford and the federal agents present, Colin would simply physically overpower me. He would take the cane, destroy the evidence, and call the police to report that his deranged father had attacked the doctor. I had to absorb the abuse. I had to let them believe they had completely broken my spirit. I focused all my agonizing emotional pain and channeled it into a masterclass of physical acting. I did not yell. I did not defend my honor. I let my shoulders shake violently. I squeezed my eyes shut and forced real tears to stream down my wrinkled cheeks. I began to weep openly and loudly. It was not a proud, defiant cry. It was the pathetic, broken sobbing of a confused child. I lifted my trembling hands to my face and began to apologize to the empty air. I mumbled that I did not mean to cause any trouble. I cried out for Martha, asking where she had gone and why the house was so dark. The performance was visceral and absolutely humiliating. I sacrificed every ounce of my personal dignity to maintain the illusion of my total cognitive collapse. Weber leaned back in his wooden chair, looking highly satisfied with my physical breakdown. But he needed undeniable proof of my supposed aggressive tendencies for his court report. He decided to introduce a physical element to the psychological torture. He reached down and grabbed the mahogany walking cane resting against my leg. He did not ask for permission. He yanked it forcefully from my grasp. The sudden movement pulled my arm forward sharply. He held the cane up to the light, examining the heavy brass handle. He told me that a man in my deteriorating condition had absolutely no business carrying a heavy wooden club. He stated that it was a dangerous weapon, and he was officially confiscating it for the safety of the household. My heart stopped completely. The hollow chamber inside that wood held the stolen toxic sedatives. It held the only physical evidence that could save my wife and send my son to prison. If Weber walked out of the house with that cane, the legal siege would become permanent, and my entire counterattack would disintegrate. The panic that flared in my chest was absolutely genuine. I reached out for the cane with shaking hands. Weber pulled it back just out of my reach, smiling a cold, cruel smile. He asked me if I was going to hit him. He challenged me to take it back by force. Colin shifted his weight, stepping closer, ready to tackle me to the floor. The trap was balanced on a razor edge. I had to retrieve the cane without displaying a single shred of aggressive competence. I fell to my knees on the thick living room carpet. I did not lunge at the doctor. I collapsed at his feet. I wrapped my arms around my own chest and began to rock back and forth, wailing with a high-pitched, terrifying pitch. I begged him not to take my walking stick. I mumbled a frantic, incoherent story about how the cane was the only thing holding my legs together. I told him the wood was magic, and without it my bones would turn to dust. I degraded myself completely. I abandoned all logic and embraced the persona of a profoundly, severely demented man, terrified by a non-existent threat. I pawed at his pant leg, weeping uncontrollably, begging for the wooden stick, like a starving dog begging for a scrap of meat. The display of utter, pathetic desperation was too much even for the corrupt psychiatrist. He looked down at me with genuine revulsion. He had expected a proud, angry old man. He had expected a physical fight he could document as dangerous paranoia. Instead, he found a weeping, shattered shell of a human being rolling on the carpet. The threat level dropped to absolute zero. He tossed the mahogany cane onto the floor next to me with a loud thud. He told Colin that I was entirely pathetic. He stated that I was completely incapable of independent thought, let alone coordinated violence. Weber opened his black leather notebook and began writing his final assessment. He documented that Henry was suffering from end-stage cognitive failure marked by severe emotional volatility and complete detachment from reality. He signed his name at the bottom of the page, pressing the pen down hard. Colin let out a long breath of relief. The required legal documentation was complete. The ex parte guardianship petition was now fully supported by a licensed medical professional. They had won the battle. I stayed on the floor, clutching the mahogany cane to my chest, crying fake tears into the carpet, while securing the poison tightly against my heart. I had survived the interrogation, and the countdown to their total destruction was finally entering its final phase. The execution of the snare was swift and suffocating. I remained on the thick living room carpet, clutching my mahogany cane. Colin reached down and grabbed me by the collar of my shirt. He hauled me to my feet with a rough, careless motion. My joints ached, but I maintained my posture of complete physical ruin. I let my head hang low, staring at the polished tips of my expensive leather shoes. Dr. Weber closed his black leather notebook with a sharp, snapping sound. He gave Colin a brief, silent nod, confirming that the legal execution was officially sanctioned. The psychiatrist picked up his briefcase and walked toward the front door without saying a single word to me. He had secured his exorbitant fee and wanted no part of the messy aftermath. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind him. The medical evaluation was over, but the financial slaughter was just beginning. Rachel walked out of the kitchen and entered the living room carrying a polished silver tray. The wealthy guests who had finished their decadent desserts began to wander back into the living area, holding crystal glasses of port wine and expensive cognac. They gathered around the perimeter of the room, forming a silent, captive audience for the final act of Rachel's theatrical masterpiece. She placed the silver tray on the low-glass coffee table directly in front of my leather armchair. Resting on the polished metal was a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy white bond paper. Next to the papers lay a heavy gold fountain pen. It was the exact pen I had received from the mayor after completing the downtown suspension bridge project 2 decades ago. Rachel was using my own ceremonial instrument to sign my death warrant. She turned to the assembled crowd of corporate colleagues and affluent neighbors. She smoothed the front of her dark velvet gown and let out a long, trembling sigh. She announced that the visiting doctor had confirmed their worst fears. She told the guests that my cognitive decline was severe, irreversible, and deeply dangerous. She claimed that the doctor had strongly recommended immediate transfer to a specialized memory care facility for my own physical safety. The guests murmured in sympathetic agreement, shaking their heads at the tragic cruelty of aging. Rachel turned her gaze to me. Her eyes were completely devoid of human warmth. They were the cold, calculating eyes of a diamond merchant evaluating a flawless stone. She picked up the thick stack of papers and knelt gracefully beside my armchair. She spoke to me in a loud, slow voice as if she were addressing a toddler or a person who did not understand the English language. She told me that these documents were simply medical insurance forms and facility admission papers. She claimed they were necessary to ensure I received the best possible care in a comfortable, secure environment. She explicitly stated in front of 30 witnesses that the papers had absolutely nothing to do with my finances or my property. It was the most audacious, magnificent lie I had ever heard. I looked down at the documents resting on her knees. My vision was perfectly clear. My mind was razor sharp. I have spent my entire life reading complex architectural blueprints and dense municipal contracts. I did not need to read the fine print to understand what she was holding. The first page was not an insurance form. It was a comprehensive, irrevocable asset relinquishment agreement. The bold legal text at the top of the page explicitly transferred sole ownership of the estate, the liquid capital, and the entire physical contents of the house directly to Colin. The second page was a complete surrender of my medical proxy granting Rachel absolute authority to approve or deny any life-saving treatments for both me and Martha. They were not just stealing my wealth. They were establishing total dictatorial control over our physical bodies. They wanted the legal right to pull the plug the exact second we became inconvenient. Rachel picked up the heavy gold fountain pen and removed the cap. She pressed the cold metal barrel into my trembling right hand. She pointed a perfectly manicured fingernail at the blank signature line at the bottom of the first page. She ordered me to sign my name. The tension in the room was absolute. The wealthy guests watched in reverent silence, believing they were witnessing a heartbreaking moment of familial sacrifice. Colin stepped closer, standing directly over my shoulder. His physical presence was a heavy, suffocating threat. I knew exactly what was happening. Rachel and Colin were too greedy to wait for the judge to finalize the emergency guardianship order tomorrow morning. They wanted my signature on a voluntary asset transfer tonight. They believed that having my signature witnessed by 30 respectable members of society would make the theft completely bulletproof against any future legal scrutiny. They did not know that they were walking blindly into a lethal trap. They did not know that 3 days ago I had legally signed over my absolute proxy and all trust controls to Vance Crawford. They did not know that by forcing me to sign these specific documents under false pretenses, they were actively committing felony wire fraud and criminal extortion on a massive scale. I was not signing away my empire. I was signing their federal indictments. I gripped the gold pen. I let my hand shake violently. I lowered the nib to the heavy white paper and allowed the black ink to bleed into the fibers. I signed my name with a slow, jagged scrawl that barely resembled my actual signature. It looked exactly like the handwriting of a man whose mind was completely fractured. Rachel quickly flipped to the second page. She pointed to the next line. I signed it again. I signed away the house. I signed away the bank accounts. I signed away the antique furniture the appraiser had just tagged. I signed every single page she placed in front of me. I played the role of the defeated, broken old man to absolute perfection. When the final signature was complete, Rachel snatched the papers from my lap with terrifying speed. She clutched the documents to her taller chest, holding them as if they were a newborn child. Her face flushed with a sudden, overwhelming rush of euphoric victory. The mask of the sorrowful caregiver slipped completely, revealing the pure, unadulterated greed hiding underneath. She stood up and walked over to Colin, handing him the stack of papers. Colin took the documents, and his entire physical posture transformed. The nervous, aggressive energy vanished. He stood incredibly tall, expanding his chest, inflating with the absolute certainty of his triumph. He had conquered his father. He had stolen the kingdom. He was the undisputed master of the estate. Colin walked over to my armchair. He leaned down, placing both of his hands firmly on the leather armrests, trapping me in the seat. He lowered his face until I could feel his breath against my cheek. He did not bother to hide his profound contempt. He whispered into my ear, his voice dripping with smug arrogance. He told me that I was a pathetic fool. He stated that the state-run memory care facility was not a comfortable retreat. He called it a chemical prison. He told me that he had called the transport company while I was in the bathroom. He had paid them double to accelerate the timeline. He whispered the final devastating threat directly into my ear. He told me the asylum transport van was not coming on Friday morning. It was arriving at the front gate at exactly 5 o'clock tomorrow morning. He told me I had less than 8 hours of freedom left in my entire life. He promised me that I would never see the sun rise over this house ever again. Colin stood back up and adjusted his expensive silk tie. He turned to the crowded room and raised his crystal glass of champagne high into the air. Rachel walked to his side, raising her own glass, the stolen emeralds glittering brilliantly against her throat. Colin offered a loud, booming toast to the future and to the enduring legacy of the family. The wealthy guests raised their glasses in unison, echoing his words, sipping their expensive wine, completely unaware of the monstrous crime they had just witnessed. I sat silently in the deep leather armchair, surrounded by my enemies. I did not panic. I did not let the fear of the dawn transport van break my concentration. I gripped the smooth brass handle of my hollow mahogany cane, feeling the 10 toxic pills resting safely inside the wood. Colin and Rachel had reached the absolute peak of their arrogance. They stood at the very summit of their false victory. They believed the war was over. They had absolutely no idea that I had already triggered the avalanche, and it was currently rushing down the mountain to bury them alive. The crystal glasses were still raised in the air when the heavy brass knocker on the front door sounded. It was not a polite tentative tap. It was a series of sharp, forceful blows that echoed through the entire house, completely shattering the joyful ambiance of the dinner party. Colin lowered his champagne flute and checked the gold watch on his wrist. A brief flicker of confusion crossed his face. He looked over at Rachel, who merely shrugged her shoulders, assuming it was a late arrival from the country club. I knew differently. I remained seated in the deep leather armchair, gripping the mahogany cane. I felt the precise vibration of those knocks in my chest. The timing was absolutely perfect. Colin set his glass down on the silver tray next to the forged legal documents. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket and walked toward the foyer with the arrogant stride of a man who believed he owned the world. He assumed the medical transport team had simply arrived a few hours early to collect their prisoner. He reached out and pulled the heavy wooden door wide open, ready to issue his tyrannical commands. The cold night air rushed into the warm house, carrying with it the absolute destruction of his empire. Colin did not speak. The welcoming insult he had prepared died instantly in his throat. I watched from my chair as the physical shock hit my son. It was a visceral, physiological reaction. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin the color of wet ash. His broad, confident shoulders collapsed inward, as if an invisible weight had just been dropped directly onto his spine. He took an involuntary step backward, his leather shoes scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He raised his hands in a weak defensive gesture, completely paralyzed by the sight of the people standing on the front porch. A man stepped over the threshold and entered the brightly lit foyer. It was Vance Crawford. He did not look like a friendly neighborhood lawyer. He looked like an apex predator stepping into a cage of terrified mice. He wore an immaculate midnight blue suit and carried a sleek black armored briefcase. He radiated a cold, lethal authority that instantly demanded absolute submission. Vance did not wait for an invitation to enter my home. He marched forward, forcing Colin to stumble backward to avoid a physical collision. Right behind Vance walked Dr. Foster. The dental surgeon had traded her white clinical coat for a heavy winter jacket, but her face carried the same furious, righteous anger I had seen in her office 2 days ago. She stepped into the foyer and locked her eyes directly on Colin, glaring at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. But it was the presence of the men behind her that completely paralyzed the room. 3 large uniformed police detectives marched into the house. Their heavy black boots hit the floorboards with a synchronized, terrifying rhythm. They wore thick tactical vests and carried heavy-duty utility belts. Their radios crackled with bursts of harsh static, cutting through the soft classical music playing from the living room speakers. The sheer physical weight of their arrival sucked all the oxygen out of the house. This was not a polite inquiry. This was a coordinated tactical raid. The reaction of the dinner party was instantaneous and profound. The loud, arrogant chatter died in a fraction of a second. A wealthy neighbor standing near the fireplace dropped his crystal glass of expensive cognac. It hit the stone hearth and shattered into 100 pieces, but nobody even looked down at the mess. The affluent guests froze completely, turning into terrified statues. They stared at the 3 armed police officers standing in the middle of the elegant foyer. These were people who lived their entire lives shielded by wealth and gated communities. The sudden violent intrusion of criminal justice into their decadent social event was completely incomprehensible to them. Rachel stood frozen in the center of the living room. The triumphant smile she had worn just moments ago peeled away from her face, revealing the raw panic hiding beneath. She clutched the heavy platinum emerald necklace resting against her throat, as if she were trying to protect it from being violently ripped away. She looked at Colin, demanding a silent explanation, but her husband was completely incapacitated. He stood trembling near the coat closet, staring at the police badges, reflecting the bright light of the crystal chandelier. The absolute peak of their arrogance had crumbled into dust in less than 10 seconds. Vance Crawford did not look at the terrified guests. He did not look at Rachel dripping in stolen jewelry. He looked directly across the room and locked his eyes on me. I sat in the leather chair, wearing the mask of the broken, confused old man for the very last time. I gave him a slow, deliberate nod. Vance acknowledged the signal. He turned his attention back to my son. He walked past Colin, leaving the trembling man in the care of the 3 police detectives. Vance marched straight into the center of the living room and stopped directly in front of the low glass coffee table. He looked down at the silver tray resting on the glass. He looked at the thick stack of legal documents and the heavy gold fountain pen. The snare was perfectly illuminated. The silence in the room was so thick it felt like physical pressure. The guests held their breath, waiting for the explosion. Vance Crawford reached down and picked up the freshly signed asset relinquishment forms. He held the thick white paper up to the light of the chandelier, inspecting the jagged, panicked signatures I had intentionally forged just minutes ago. He turned his head slowly and fixed his cold, predatory gaze on Rachel. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to shout to project absolute dominance. His voice was quiet, sharp, and completely devoid of mercy. He stated that the party was officially over. The digital blockade was broken. The legal siege was shattered. The silent readjustment had reached its terminal velocity, and there was absolutely no escape for anyone standing in that room. Rachel broke the paralyzing silence with a sharp, breathless gasp. Her initial terror rapidly mutated into indignant, furious rage. She marched toward the center of the living room, pointing a trembling, manicured finger directly at the lead police detective. She demanded that they vacate her private property this exact second. She raised her voice, attempting to summon the arrogant authority she had wielded just moments ago. She told the officers that they were illegally trespassing on a private estate and interrupting a highly sensitive family medical intervention. She threatened to call the police commissioner, claiming she played golf with his wife every Sunday. She insisted that her husband was the sole legal owner of the house and that they had absolutely no warrant to breach her front door. The 3 uniformed detectives did not flinch. They did not retreat a single inch. The lead officer simply rested his hand on his heavy leather utility belt and looked at her with an expression of profound boredom. He had dealt with arrogant, wealthy criminals before, and her expensive velvet dress offered her absolutely no legal immunity. Vance Crawford completely ignored Rachel, frantic screaming. He stood perfectly still under the bright light of the crystal chandelier, holding the freshly signed asset relinquishment documents in his right hand. He flipped through the thick white pages, studying the jagged ink signatures I had deliberately forged. He turned his cold, analytical gaze toward my son. Colin was still pressed against the wall of the foyer, sweating profusely, unable to articulate a single defense. Vance spoke with a voice that cut through the tension like a surgical scalpel. He addressed the entire room, ensuring that every wealthy neighbor and corporate colleague heard the exact parameters of the legal snare. He reminded everyone present of the specific words Rachel had just spoken aloud. He stated that Rachel had publicly presented these documents as standard medical insurance forms and facility admission papers. She had explicitly promised 30 witnesses that the paperwork had absolutely nothing to do with the transfer of financial assets or property ownership. Vance held the first page high in the air for the terrified guests to see. He announced that the document was in fact an irrevocable asset relinquishment agreement engineered to strip a 72-year-old man of his entire life savings. The affluent guests gasped, backing away from the silver tray and the coffee table as if the furniture had suddenly caught fire. The wealthy neighbors who had just praised Rachel for her bravery now stared at her with absolute revulsion. Vance lowered the papers and delivered the first devastating blow to their legal defense. He informed Colin that the signatures on the documents were completely legally void. He explained that precisely 3 days ago I had visited a secure downtown office and signed a comprehensive legal proxy transferring absolute control of my entire estate and all blind trusts directly to Vance's corporate litigation firm. I had possessed absolutely no legal capacity to sign away my house tonight. The documents were nothing more than worthless paper stained with ink. Rachel let out a harsh, desperate laugh. She crossed her arms over her chest, clutching the stolen emerald necklace. She told Vance that if the documents were void, then no crime had been committed. She claimed it was merely a misunderstanding about the nature of the paperwork. She smiled a sickening, confident smile, believing she had found a technical loophole to escape the trap. Vance looked at her with eyes completely devoid of mercy. He informed her that the crime was not the successful transfer of the assets. The crime was the deliberate, orchestrated attempt to steal them through coercion and deception. Vance gestured toward the 3 police detectives standing in the foyer. He announced that the entire dinner party, the psychological interrogation, and the coerced signing of the documents had been recorded on tape. He revealed that the private catering company Colin had hired for the lavish event was actually a specialized undercover team employed by Vance's own forensic investigation firm. The waiters carrying the silver trays of roasted meats and expensive champagne were licensed private investigators. They wore microscopic high-definition cameras pinned to their crisp white uniforms. Every single abusive word Rachel had spoken to me, every manipulative lie she had told the guests, and every threat Colin had whispered into my ear had been live-streamed directly to the police department on a secure encrypted channel. The investigators had captured Rachel explicitly lying about the nature of the legal documents and forcing me to sign them under extreme psychological duress. The legal trap snapped completely shut, breaking the spine of their arrogance. Vance Crawford listed the specific charges with terrifying mechanical precision. He stated that by presenting fraudulent documents across state financial lines, they had committed massive federal wire fraud. By threatening to lock me in a chemical psychiatric prison unless I complied with their demands, they had committed criminal extortion. By publicly stripping an elderly man of his autonomy and attempting to steal his estate, they had committed felony elder abuse of the highest order. He told Rachel that her actions were not a simple misunderstanding. They were premeditated, malicious felonies caught entirely on digital tape in front of 30 civilian witnesses and a team of undercover investigators. Colin finally found his voice. He pushed himself off the foyer wall and pointed a shaking finger toward the front door. He screamed that Dr. Weber had signed the official psychiatric evaluation confirming my violent insanity. Colin claimed the doctor report proved they were only acting in my best interest. Vance Crawford did not even blink. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small black radio. He pressed the transmission button and requested a status update from the exterior perimeter. A gruff voice crackled through the speaker, echoing loudly in the silent living room. The voice confirmed that Dr. Weber had been intercepted on the front lawn the exact second he stepped out of the house. The corrupt psychiatrist was currently sitting in the back of a police cruiser, wearing steel handcuffs, having already fully confessed to falsifying the medical documents in exchange for a massive cash bribe from Colin. The final pillar of their fabricated legal defense collapsed into absolute ruin, leaving them entirely exposed to the crushing weight of the justice system. I remained seated in the deep leather armchair, observing the absolute destruction of their false kingdom. I lifted my hollow mahogany cane from the floor. I gripped the thick wooden shaft with my left hand and grabbed the heavy brass handle with my right. I twisted the metal counterclockwise. The hidden threads released with a soft, grinding sound that seemed deafening in the sudden silence of the living room. I pulled the handle away, exposing the dark cylindrical chamber inside the wood. I turned the cane upside down and tipped it over the glass coffee table. 10 oblong yellow pills tumbled out. They hit the polished glass surface with a sharp rattling noise. The affluent guests stared at the pills in total confusion. Colin stared at them with absolute paralyzing terror. He recognized the heavy sedatives immediately. He realized that his perfectly engineered chemical weapon had been compromised directly under his own roof. Dr. Foster stepped forward, pushing past the lead police detective. She reached into her heavy winter jacket and pulled out a folded white laboratory document. She dropped the official hospital toxicology report right next to the yellow pills on the glass table. She did not speak to Colin or Rachel. She addressed the police detectives and the entire room of wealthy witnesses holding nothing back. She stated that I had secretly delivered a sample of those exact pills to her clinic just hours ago through a trusted courier. She explained that the laboratory had rushed a comprehensive chemical analysis. Dr. Foster pointed a stern, accusing finger at the yellow tablets. She announced that they were not blood pressure medication or harmless daily vitamins. She stated with absolute medical authority that they were highly restricted industrial psychiatric sedatives. She explained that administering these specific drugs to an elderly, frail woman without a prescription was not merely gross medical malpractice. It was a deliberate, calculated attempt to induce a fatal cardiac arrest. It was premeditated, attempted murder. The estate appraiser standing near the antique grandfather clock finally processed the sheer magnitude of the situation. He was not just tagging expensive furniture for a greedy, impatient son. He was actively participating in the rapid liquidation of an estate belonging to a woman who was currently being poisoned upstairs. The color completely drained from his thin face. He dropped his digital tablet in sheer panic. The expensive device hit the hardwood floor, and the glass screen shattered instantly, sending tiny shards scattering across the rug. He did not bother to pick it up. He did not ask Colin for his professional appraisal fee. He simply turned and ran for his life. He sprinted through the elegant foyer, shoving his way past the police detectives, and fled into the cold night air, desperate to escape the blast radius of a massive federal criminal conspiracy. He left the heavy front door swinging wide open behind him. The lead police detective did not care about the fleeing appraiser. He focused entirely on the physical evidence of attempted murder resting on the coffee table. He unclipped the heavy metal handcuffs from his utility belt, letting them rattle loudly. He looked at Colin and Rachel, but he did not move toward them first. He turned his attention to the hallway leading to the utility corridor. He barked a loud, authoritative command, ordering the private medical contractor to step into the living room immediately, with her hands visible. Nurse Thompson walked slowly out of the dark shadows of the corridor. She was no longer acting like the arrogant mercenary who had marched me around the neighborhood like a prison guard that afternoon. She was trembling violently, shaking from head to toe. Her crisp white medical scrubs suddenly looked exactly like a prison uniform. The detective walked straight toward her. He grabbed her wrists, twisting her arms forcefully behind her back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around her wrists echoed loudly through the silent house. He informed her that she was under arrest for the illegal distribution of controlled narcotics and conspiracy to commit murder. He began to recite her legal rights, but she did not let him finish a single sentence. Nurse Thompson possessed absolutely no loyalty to my son. She was a mercenary driven entirely by greed, and the exact moment she faced 20 years in a federal penitentiary, she immediately turned on her wealthy employers. She began to scream her confession right there in the middle of my living room. She cried hysterically, tears streaming down her face, completely ruining her makeup. She pointed her handcuffed hands directly at Rachel. She screamed that the daughter-in-law had paid her $10,000 in untraceable cash to keep me locked on the ground floor. She yelled that Colin had provided the toxic yellow pills and explicitly ordered her to force them down Martha's throat every single morning and every single night. She completely dismantled their fabricated story of a loving, devoted family struggling with a terrible burden. She told the horrified, wealthy guests that Colin and Rachel laughed about the poison when they thought no one was listening. She stated that Rachel would sit in the kitchen, drinking my expensive wine, placing cruel bets on how many days it would take for Martha Hart to finally stop beating so they could inherit the millions. The affluent neighbors covered their mouths in absolute shock. The corporate colleagues who had just toasted to Colin magnificent success now looked at him as if he were a literal monster. The absolute truth was ugly, brutal, and completely undeniable. The confession was pouring out of the corrupt nurse like violent water from a shattered dam, completely drowning my son and my daughter-in-law in their own monstrous guilt. The two remaining police detectives moved with swift, tactical precision. They drew their heavy black weapons and ordered Colin and Rachel to get down on the hardwood floor immediately. Colin dropped to his knees, weeping openly, his arrogant pride completely destroyed. Rachel stood frozen, her eyes wide with sheer animal panic, refusing to accept her reality. A detective grabbed her firmly by the shoulder, forcing her down, ruining her expensive velvet gown against the floorboards. The click of the steel handcuffs securing their wrists was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The snare had completely crushed them. The cold steel cut brutally into the delicate skin of Rachel's wrists. The sharp metallic ratcheting sound of the handcuffs locking into place echoed through the living room, severing her connection to the wealthy elite world she had tried to conquer. The lead detective gripped her by the arms and hauled her violently to her feet. The dark velvet of her expensive evening gown twisted awkwardly around her legs, making her stumble. She struggled against the firm grip of the officers, her designer high heels scraping desperately against the polished hardwood floor. Another detective approached her and reached for the heavy platinum emerald necklace resting against her throat. He unclasped the stolen jewelry with clinical efficiency, stating that it was officially being confiscated as stolen property and evidence of financial exploitation. Rachel let out a guttural cry of absolute agony as the heavy emeralds were lifted away from her skin and placed onto the glass coffee table next to the toxic yellow pills. She was completely stripped of her stolen armor. Colin did not fight the officers. My son remained on his knees in the center of the living room, his tailored charcoal suit wrinkled and ruined. He was weeping openly, his chest heaving with loud, pathetic sobs. He did not look like a corporate executive or the master of a massive estate. He looked exactly like a terrified child who had just realized the absolute magnitude of his own monstrous behavior. The wealthy guests who had praised him just 30 minutes ago were now frantically grabbing their coats from the foyer closet, fleeing the house to avoid being associated with a massive federal criminal investigation. The grand illusion of their high society life was dissolving into thin air, leaving nothing behind but the ugly, terrifying reality of a prison sentence. Rachel realized that the police were not going to listen to her arrogant threats. She stopped struggling against the detectives and turned her desperate, panicked eyes toward me. She did not apologize for poisoning my wife. She did not ask for forgiveness for the psychological torture she had inflicted upon me. Her sociopathy was so deeply ingrained that she could only grieve for her own material losses. She begged me to call off the lawyers. She promised that she would move out of the house immediately and never ask for another dollar if I just let her keep the luxury cars and her country club membership. She wept and pleaded for her affluent lifestyle, claiming that she would absolutely die in a concrete prison cell. She told me I was a good man, a forgiving man, and that destroying her life would not bring me any peace. I sat in the deep leather armchair, listening to her pathetic, desperate bargaining. I looked at my son, who was still staring at the floor, too cowardly to even meet my gaze. The time for deception was completely over. I released my grip on the hollow mahogany cane and let it fall to the carpet. I placed my hands on the leather armrests and pushed myself upward. I did not lean forward. I did not let my hands shake. I straightened my spine, locking my knees and pulling my shoulders back. I stood incredibly tall, towering over the two of them. The frail, broken old man they had tortured for months vanished entirely, leaving only the hardened civil engineer who had spent 40 years commanding armies of men and building structures designed to withstand massive destructive forces. I looked down at Rachel, and delivered my final absolute verdict. I told her I was not a forgiving man. I told her I was an architect of consequences. I explained that they had engineered a bridge built entirely on greed abuse and attempted murder, and now they were going to be crushed under the weight of their own collapsing structure. I promised them that Vance Crawford would legally liquidate every single asset they had ever touched. I told Rachel that her designer clothes, her luxury cars, and her hidden bank accounts would be seized to pay for the private medical care my wife now required. I looked at Colin and spoke with a voice completely devoid of any paternal affection. I told him that I had spent my entire life trying to build a legacy for him, but he had chosen to burn it to the ground. I told him that he was no longer my son. I promised them both that they would spend the next 3 decades in a federal penitentiary and that I would never visit them or accept their phone calls. I condemned them to total, absolute erasure from my life. The lead detective gave me a respectful nod and ordered his men to move the prisoners. They dragged Colin and Rachel toward the foyer. Rachel began to scream hysterically, thrashing against the officers as they forced her through the heavy wooden front door. Colin walked with his head hanging down, defeated and entirely broken. I stood in the center of my living room and watched them disappear into the cold night. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminated the manicured front lawn, casting long, frantic shadows across the walls of my home. I listened to the heavy car doors slam shut. I watched the police vehicles back out of my driveway and accelerate down the affluent street, carrying the poison completely away from my family. Vance Crawford picked up his armored briefcase and the silver tray holding the forged legal documents. He told me his legal team would be at the courthouse at dawn to permanently dissolve the fraudulent power of attorney and secure the estate. He shook my hand with a firm, steady grip and walked out the front door, closing it quietly behind him. The house was suddenly profoundly silent. It was not the suffocating, terrifying silence of a domestic prison. It was the deep, peaceful silence of a structure that had finally been stabilized. I turned away from the empty foyer and walked toward the main staircase. I did not shuffle my feet. Every step I took on the wooden boards was firm and deliberate. I climbed the stairs and walked down the hallway to the master bedroom. The heavy brass padlock was still hanging from the outside latch. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the key I had hidden days ago, and unlocked the door. The heavy metal chain fell away. I opened the door and stepped into the dark, quiet room. The moonlight filtered through the curtains, illuminating the large bed. Martha was sleeping peacefully, her chest rising and falling with a slow, steady rhythm. I walked over to the side of the bed and sat down gently on the edge of the mattress. I reached out and took her frail, warm hand in mine. I felt the steady pulse of her heart against my fingers. I kissed the back of her hand and whispered into the quiet room, promising her that the monsters were gone forever. The nightmare was officially over. The foundation of our life had been severely tested, but it had not broken. I sat beside my sleeping wife, watching the moonlight cast a gentle glow across the room. I had successfully executed the silent readjustment, and I had finally reclaimed my home. The most profound lesson I learned from this terrifying ordeal is that shared blood does not automatically grant someone the title of family. True family is forged in mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and the fierce protection of the people we cherish. Society often mistakes the silence of the elderly for weakness, assuming that advanced age erases our capacity to fight back. But accumulated wisdom and calculated patience are the most devastating weapons of all. When toxic people mistake your quiet endurance for vulnerability, you must not hesitate to completely dismantle the bridges you built for them to reclaim your absolute peace. If you have ever had to fiercely protect your own dignity from toxic family members who underestimated your strength, please hit the like button, share your survival story in the comments below, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives of justice.